critical part of the justification for this war of conquest, which we haven't talked much about, is racial. Manifest destiny was manifestly white. Right? All this talk of this land belonging to Americans was a racial concept. In some ways more than a national one. And for that purpose, Mexicans, in the lead up to this war and during it, were defined often in propaganda, in the press, in speeches, as racial mongrels. A people who were no kind of pure race, but instead a mix, which in this understanding is understood as worse than being a pure anything, is to be a mix, a mongrel of Spaniards, Indians, and Negroes. This racial concept of Mexicans created by the white people who wanted to conquer them read them out of any definition of whiteness and defined them as racially inadequate to possess the land. They were, in the understanding of these imperialists, they were in the way of God's plan. For this reason, I don't know if it's solely for that reason, but at least partially for that reason, the invasion was incredibly brutal, violent, with all kinds of atrocities against people once they had surrendered, against Mexican civilians. There was less of these atrocities from the regular soldiers. But the volunteers from across the states were often uncontrollable by the generals. There's some of this that Taylor talks about in American Republics. People back home learned about the atrocities only if someone in the war wrote them letters. The abolitionist press published some of that stuff. But in the Democratic and Whig press, you didn't get much of it. You got celebrations of Winfield Scott, Zachary Taylor, who was a Whig, and John C. Fremont. Fremont led the American forces who took over California. Scott and Taylor led the conquest of Mexico. And I'm not going to give you battle stuff here in our Democratizing America class, except this brief overview. The United States won every significant battle of the war. And for all the people who believed in this racial and national concept of manifest destiny, that legitimized their belief. The historian, of course, does not explain things that way, so the historian points to the superiority of American artillery and other weaponry. The artillery, in particular, meant that the United States again and again pummeled Mexican positions, with the Mexicans unable to hit back. So, the United States had, as this cartoon has it, plucked the Mexican eagle. The United States could have pushed the conquest and tried to take all or almost all of the Mexican nation. But instead, the United States forced Mexico to accept a treaty created most of the border that we know today. And here's really what the U.S. was going for. Trying to take as much Mexican land as possible with as few Mexicans as possible. Does that make sense? As much land as possible with as few Mexicans in it as possible. So the United States drew the lines so as to leave the bulk of the Mexican population, which is further south around Mexico City, in Mexico. This Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed with Mexico under duress in 1848. Mexico was forced to accept $15 million while losing a third of their country to the United States. The $15 million was a signal of how imperialist and corrupt this war was. It was putting a thin veneer of legitimacy onto this conquest retroactively, so that the United States could say, oh yeah, we paid for it. We paid for it. Remember, we gave them $15 million. Mexico, of course, could not say no. They had to take the money, or the U.S. would continue to prosecute the war. You remember that under American law, only white people could come to the U.S. and naturalize as citizens. Naturalized citizenship was racially bound by federal law. But according to the terms of the treaty, and this is in the language you see over here, according to the terms of the treaty, the roughly 70,000 Mexicans who were now about to be living in the United States, the treaty said that those Mexicans had a year from the time of the treaty, and in that year they could either declare that they wanted to remain as Mexican citizens, or they could become American citizens. And the default, if they don't make a decision, the default is that they automatically become American citizens. This created great ambiguity about Mexican racial identity within the United States. Okay, at this point, kind of our turn to one of our different threads that we've been following, to touch back in with Frederick Douglass and the abolitionist movement, where in October 1846, Hugh Auld accepted payment for Frederick Douglass's legal freedom. Douglass's abolitionist friends in Britain and a few in America had raised money and purchased Douglass's freedom. Douglass was principally opposed to this method of obtaining freedom, which he believed legitimized one human's ability to own another human, which he claimed had no real existence in human society. Douglass, by this time, was essentially taking this position that it doesn't matter what a law or a constitution says. A human can't own another human. You can't do that. He returned after 18 months in Great Britain. He met with William Lloyd Garrison and told him that he intended to start his own newspaper. Garrison was against it. Garrison was generally against the colored convention movement. Garrison believed that we should act only in an integrated fashion. He had some flexibility on that at certain points in his career, but that was his general position. And he believed that Douglass having his own newspaper was going to divide the abolitionist movement further. But Douglass insisted that he needed to have a place to express his own voice, and for colored people to have a voice that was distinctively theirs. He was essentially, in some of the letters that they exchanged back and forth, Douglass was essentially saying to Garrison, I love you, I admire everything that you have done, but you cannot speak for a black person. We need to do that. The North Star, printed by a former slave, was an incredible paper which circulated across the North, outraged people in the South. Douglass also used the paper to vigorously support rights for women. He attended the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, held in upstate New York in July 1848. This was the first women's rights convention in American history. It was at this point the only women's rights convention in American history. It was organized by Lucretia Mott and Susan B. Anthony, who you remember, because you remember everything, had attended the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London back in 1840. Remember this? And they put them and British women behind a curtain and made them listen. And you may remember that back then in 1840, Mott and Anthony had said to each other, we need a convention for women's rights back in America. That was 1840. This is 1848. So it took a while. This was largely because Susan B. Anthony had gotten married and had a series of children. And this was a theme in women's activism. Children were viewed as the woman's responsibility, and so took the woman away from her activism. At Seneca Falls in 1848, the women and small number of men who gathered there drafted a declaration of sentiments. And you can see, if you read through it, they have plagiarized the Declaration of Independence. Plagiarized and repurposed. Note, perhaps the two most important passages here, that all men and women are created equal. There's a little edit there for Jefferson. That all men and women are created equal. And down here, where the Declaration of Independence had alleged that King George III was part of a conspiracy against the liberties of the colonists. The Declaration of Sentiments said that there was a conspiracy by men. Here it is. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. It was strong stuff. They voted on a series of resolutions calling for change in American society, proclaiming that all laws which prevent woman from occupying a place equal to man are of no force or authority. Whoa! That woman is man's equal. And on, you can read. All these resolutions, so they were drafted by a committee, and then they read them out loud, and then everybody votes on them, and they all were passing unanimously. Everybody, yes, 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 everybody's for it, everybody's for it. And then they got to this one, that it is the duty of women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise, that women have the duty to obtain the right to vote. And at this one, the church was suddenly divided. They were meeting in a church. People were divided. And a whole bunch of the women who had attended this women's rights convention were like, no, that's going too far. That's too far. That's too far. In the language of the time, some of them thought that to vote would be to unsex themselves. That is, to lose their status as a woman. Helping to sway the vote was a powerful speech by Frederick Douglass, who linked the struggle against slavery and the struggle for racial equality with the struggle for women's equality, and urged the women to see the two struggles as one. So it did pass. The one calling for the right to vote did pass, but it was a close vote, unlike all the others, which were unanimous. The convention was ignored by most of the country. It was like 150, 200 women meeting in a church. Most ignored it. The abolitionist press, that is the Garrison, Douglas parts of the abolitionist press, gave it some positive coverage, but for the most part, it was ignored. Those that did pay attention in the mainstream press were variously outraged and ready to make fun of it. This cartoon circulated pretty widely. It's probably the most widely circulated piece of information that people got about the Seneca Falls Convention. It's a cartoon mocking the idea of women having power. In this cartoon, it's a courtroom scene where women are the jury, women are the judges, women are the, what do you call them, the stenographers taking down the court records. Women are the lawyers, women are the bailiffs, women hold all the positions of power. And this cartoon, which is, the idea is punishing a man for not marrying a woman that he had promised to, created laughter from most people who saw it, at the idea of women holding all these positions of power. You know, how hilarious. This Seneca Falls Convention led to another convention in 1849, and then another in 1850. And this was beginning to feel, to the small number of people involved in it, like a movement for women's rights, coexisting alongside the abolitionist movement.